Good morning. Today I come with you with a new message and a fresh revelation from God. Yesterday, as I was reading my Bible, it kind of dawned on me, and it was like, don't read your Bible so that way you have a message to preach to other people. That's not my intent at all. What my intent is to read the Bible to understand God more. And within understanding God, I can share with you the revelations that he gives me. So today I want to talk to you about God, who is the great mathematician and the great chemist, and the spiritual battles that we cannot see. So in Ecclesiastes 6:10, it says, everything was already decided. It was known long ago what each person would be. So there's no use arguing with God about your destiny. And then in Ecclesiastes 3:14 and 15, it says, and I know whatever God does is final. Nothing can be added to it or taken from it. God's purpose is that people should fear him. What is happening now has happened before, and what will happen in the future has happened before, because God makes the same things happen over and over again. So a lot of people are like, Ecclesiastes, stay away from that book. It's not for me. Like, all it talks about is how, like, everything is meaningless and there's no point to human existence and everything just sucks. So, what is the point anyway? We're all going to die and return to dust. So, what's the point of living? But there's so much value in living and so much freedom in living if you just find it. So, let's go back to the beginning. In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. So this was before day one. Like, he created the heavens and he created the earth. On day one, he made lightness and darkness. Day two, he made water and sky. Day three, he made land and sea. Day four, he made the sun, moon, and stars. And day five, he made birds and fish and told them to be fruitful and multiply. So this marks an important point, because in the beginning he was only adding and adding and adding and building. But when he made the birds and the fish, he told them, start multiplying. Hold on to that thought. Day 6, he made animals and humans, and again he said, be fruitful and multiply. Then the 7th day was the Sabbath. Why? It was because God saw all he had done, and he was satisfied with how everything would continue to multiply and become bigger, better, and stronger. It's basic math. When you add $10 plus $10, you get $20. When you multiply $10 times $10, you get $100. So God saw all things good and blooming and decided to rest, like everything was working as it should. And we first see the indication of the vision when in the garden he created 4 rivers to water the land. So this was before he created mankind. He created 4 rivers to water the land, and it was good. It was good. Like, he brought up springs from underground, and they would just water the land and multiply it. So if you take, like, this is the same concept of division, as if, like, you take an 8-hour day of labor with one man, it's an 8-hour day of labor. But if you take an 8-hour day of labor and divide it by 4 people, each person only has to work 2 hours. So even in this case, division was good. Now, the earth was initially empty until God sent the rain for vegetation. God allowed all the springs to come up from underground to water the soil. So we see here God is the greatest mathematician. He adds things, divides things, and multiplies things, all which create abundance and order. So then God created man from dust, and then he breathed life into him and placed him into the garden where there was an abundance of fruit. Like, eat as much fruit as you want. It's all here just for you. And there also was the tree of life, and then the tree of knowledge of good and evil. This is where things get kind of deep, so bear with me. We first see the sign of subtraction when God causes man to fall asleep and subtracts one of his ribs to create woman. When Adam woke up, he was exhilarated. He says in Genesis 2:23, "At last, this one is bone from my bone and flesh from my flesh. She will be called woman because she was taken from man." Job 1:21 clearly shows, "Naked I come from my mother's womb, and naked I will return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." So God shows us just in the first two chapters how to add, multiply, divide, subtract, which are basic fundamentals of life. Like everything revolves around math. Like think of fractals and how fractals are like the existence of everything. So it was then that he gave his first command to not eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In Genesis 2:25, it shows that man and his wife were both naked, but they felt no shame. And why did they feel no shame? It's because they had no knowledge. They had no concept. What is good and what is evil? They had no conception of like, this is so bad that we're all naked. They didn't know. So shame was not yet introduced because who knew then? Because they hadn't eaten that apple of knowledge that divides what is good and what is evil. We only knew at that point that what God did is good. So behind the scenes, God was also a very great chemist. We all know the basic fundamentals of all matter are atoms. Atoms are made up of both positive and negative to create a balance. Before Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, there was already atoms in place transferring energy to create all matter that exists today. They had no conceptualization of what was positive and what was negative. They only knew God was. And what is the greatest two words in the Bible? It is when God says, "I am." So this is going to get a little geeky and nerdy for a second, but we're going to break down the fundamentals of atoms. So you have protons, which are positively charged existing in the nucleus. Then you have neutrons, which are neutral, but they add mass, resulting in isotopes. Then you have electrons. They are negatively charged particles that orbit the neuron and the protons. The neutrons and the protons. It creates an electron shell of negative forces. They are smaller than the protons and neutrons, but they determine the chemical property and its ability to bond with other atoms. Let that sink in for a moment. Ionic bonds form when atoms transfer electrons, creating positives and negatives. And it's when the positives and negatives are just drawn to each other, whereas covalent bonds are a little different. They are bonds created when electrons are shared. Think of Adam and Eve in the garden, and the first evidence of this was when Eve was created from Adam's rib. They formed a covalent bond. These atoms create all matter in the universe. This room I'm in, the air I breathe, my car when I drive, the building I drive to. You get the picture. It creates everything. Thus, there's activity going on that we cannot even see as a result of protons and electrons interacting. We also have something called positrons. These are the antiparticle of electrons, and when they come together, they annihilate each other to the point of non-existence and resulting in an energy reaction. I'm going to pause here and let you soak it in for a minute because this is very complex and I understand that it might take a moment for it to actually sink in and for you to absorb this, but it is surrounded in foundation and truth that is found directly in the Bible. It shows us how incredibly sovereign God is and how wise and knowledgeable God is that he orchestrates these things to work together, both positives and negatives, to interact with each other and create a symbiosis. Anyway, so in the beginning, in the very first line of the Bible, there was a fundamental symmetry between matter and antimatter. So let's then go back to Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 13. For everything there is a season, a time for every activity under the heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to turn away, a time when to search and a time to quit searching, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be quiet and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, time for war and a time for peace. I just need a sip of water. Again, you can see all the fundamental symmetry here. And as Job said in Job 121, the Lord gives and he takes away. So we know that as fundamental biblical truth. God gives and he takes away. He gives and he takes away. 1 Thessalonians 5:18 reads, in everything give thanks, for this is God's will for you in Jesus Christ. Everything give thanks. So the good that's happening, the bad that's happening, everything that's happening, give thanks. This does not mean to just give thanks for the good we see God is doing. It means to give him thanks in everything, because we don't know what God is orchestrating behind the scenes. That is the mystery of God. There's a quote by a philosopher that I love that says you cannot step in the same river twice. This indicates that because a river is flowing, it's in a constant state of flux, which means that as the river is flowing, then particles are constantly shifting and constantly moving. And so you really can't step in the same river twice, because the atoms are all different the second time you step in it, even if it's 2 seconds later. Now, one of my favorite quotes that I came up with back in 2014 is, the world is going to keep turning even if you're standing still, lost in a moment. If we understand the basic elements of an atom and how it creates all matter, then we can understand that there's energy moving that we can't see. This is a spiritual battle that we've heard so many people talk about, but we don't, or at least I don't, or I'm just beginning to fully comprehend. Ephesians 6:13 says, for we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. So is this kind of coming together for you now and kind of making sense? So Ecclesiastes 1:4, I'm dwelling in the book of Ecclesiastes because I feel like it's the most misunderstood book. So Ecclesiastes 1:4 says, generations come and generations go, but the earth never changes. 1:9 says, history merely repeats itself. It has all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new. So circling back to the beginning again, everything that has happened has already happened before in the spiritual world. God knew Adam and Eve would fall, just as God knew Abraham, Isaac, Joseph, and what their purposes in life would be that led to Jesus' birth. God knew Moses would escape Egypt and the Israelites would wander the desert for 40 years. He knew Joshua would lead the Israelites to victory and the promised land. He knew the kings would reign. He knew Israel would fall to Assyria and Judah to Babylon. God knew all these things would happen. In Habakkuk 1:5, it even says, like God says, look around at the nations, look around and be amazed, for I am doing something in your own day, something you wouldn't believe, even if someone told you about it. I'm raising up the Babylonians, a cruel and violent people. If we read that verse, we would be like, what? God raised the Babylonians to steal the promised land of Judah? But we fail to recognize the order of events that are needed to be carefully orchestrated for God to restore humanity by sending his son Jesus. That is why it says in Ecclesiastes 1:18, the greater my wisdom, the greater my grief. To increase knowledge only increases sorrow. Then in 2:12 through 16, it says, so I decided to compare wisdom with foolishness and madness, for who can do this better than I, the king? I thought wisdom is better than foolishness, just as light is better than darkness. For the wise can see where they are going, but fools walk in the dark. Yet I saw the wise and the foolish share the same fate. Both will die. So I said to myself, since I will end up the same as the fool, what's the value of my wisdom? This is all meaningless, for the wise and the foolish both die. The wise will not be remembered and any longer than the fool. In the days to come, both will be forgotten. Then in Ecclesiastes 3:11 it says, yet God had made everything beautiful for its own time. He has planted eternity in the heart. But even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from the beginning to the end. So we see, and this is a verse I stated earlier, the purpose of man, plain and simple, in Ecclesiastes 12:13. It states that the purpose of man is to fear God and keep his commandments. To understand that God is sovereign and he's in control of everything that happens in the world. And we don't have to hold so tightly to control the outcomes. It's election time and people are scared and fearful. Like, nobody knows who's going to win. Like, everyone's like, if this person wins, then all hell's going to break loose. But if this person wins, all hell's going to break loose. So all hell's going to break loose anyway. It's election time. But do you not think that that is part of God's plan? Matthew 10:39 says, whoever finds his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. We should continue praying for God to shift the atmosphere, but we should also recognize that God is fully in control and creating a masterpiece, even if we cannot fully see the things that he's doing. Romans 8:28 says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. All things, the good, the bad, the amazing, the ugly, everything works together for the good and for the glory of God.